I'm Charlie Firestone. I'm director of the Communications and Society Policy Program at the Aspen Institute. And my program, among other things, has been charged by the Knight Foundation to run a commission on trust, media, and democracy. And I'm pleased that we have several of the commissioners as part of this panel. The premise is that trust is an essential ingredient in democracy. If we don't trust in the process and we don't trust others to be able to run the government, you have basically a loss of legitimacy. So what we see is essentially we should have a kind of golden rule of democracy, ruling as if you will not be in charge one day. And unfortunately, our situation is such that Republicans and Democrats each think that the other cannot run our country. So we have a period now where we're losing trust in democratic institutions, and particularly the media. It's also important in a democracy to have a healthy distrust, and that is to hold our leaders and our institutions accountable. And that is the role, among others, of the press. It's also the role of other institutions. But let's remember that the press is the only business instantiated in the Constitution with a freedom of press, and part of that is because we need to hold people accountable. So the questions we're going to address today are, how bad is it in terms of the loss of trust in the United States and other countries around the world? And we're going to have a great presentation for the first 10 minutes on that. Then we're going to look at issues of the press itself. Why is there this loss of trust in the press, and what can we do about it? And what can they do about it? And then we're going to look at platforms and citizenship and the other elements that come into play when we think about restoring trust in this country and our democratic institutions. So to begin, we have Michael Stewart, who is the vice chairman of Edelman & Company and a former head of Edelman Europe and formerly McKinsey & Company, who will walk us through the Edelman Trust Barometer.
Thank you, Charlie. It's a real honor and privilege to be here to help frame this very important discussion today. At Edelman, we've been studying trust around the world for 18 years. We study trust in 4 institutions: government, business, media, and NGOs across 28 countries. Charlie asked me to say a few words about methodology. For each of the countries that we survey, we have a representative survey sample for that country, so national representative sample. We're in the field each year between October and November. So just put that in context as we're doing some of the findings. Things have happened since then. That could have implications even further on the findings that we're going to show. We break the results into 2 categories: general public, which is basically all respondents, 33,000 people around the world, and informed public. The informed public, this is jumping around, there we go. The informed public is 15% of the sample, and it's people who have a university degree. They have in the top quartile of income, and they describe themselves as avid consumers of media. And so we'll show a little bit of the differences between the general public and the informed public. For this presentation, I'm going to cover overall state of trust in the world at a high level, and then very specifically state of trust in the US and state of trust in media in the US. So at the global level, what this chart shows is we're living currently in a world of distrust. Of the 28 countries that we survey, 20 of them are in deep distrust level. For trust versus distrust, anything above 60% we count as a trusting society. Anything at 49% or below we count as distrusters. So 20 of the 28 are in the distrust category. China, you'll note, is at the highest level of trust. That's the first time China's ever been #1. And the United States had a 9-point drop in general public trust last year, which is the largest single country drop that we've ever seen. Now, when you look at the informed public, typically we see the informed public is a more trusting constituency. And that's true again this year. You can note that there's more trusting countries in the informed public and far fewer distrusting countries. However, I would call out the incredibly stark results for the United States last year. In 1 year, among informed public, there was a 23-point drop in trust. The United States informed public is now the least trusting in the world, tied with South Africa. Now, we also break out the 4 institutions and give you first a global overview. Typically, what we've seen over the past 18 years is you see ebbs and flows. Trust will go up in some institutions in a given year and down in others. Typically, if government drops significantly, business might go up, et cetera. 2 years ago, for the first time ever, we saw trust decrease in all 4 institutions, quite dramatically. And last year, we saw no recovery. So we basically had 2 years with the lowest level of trust in all 4 institutions that we've ever seen globally. And unfortunately, in the US, the situation is significantly worse. So for both informed public and general public, we saw a significant decrease in trust in every single institution. And as you'll note in the informed public, as I said previously, the drops are dramatic, 20 and 30 points for each institution. And now, in the US, the informed public is as distrusting of media and government as the general public, and that's the first time we've ever seen that in any country. Now we take a global look at media as an institution. There's both good and bad news in here. The media is distrusted in 22 of 28 countries. That's not, obviously not ideal news. The good news this year is we have seen more countries with increases in trust, 12, than decreases, 10. But it is still overall a pretty significant state of distrust among the media. But it's important to understand what people think of when they respond to a question about media. So we asked them, what do you assume is meant by media in general? And the answers are quite surprising, and they show a big change in how people perceive the media. So thankfully, traditional journalism is still top of mind. Gets a significant percentage of almost 90%. But you'll notice platforms and even branded content and influencers are now interpreted as media. And so for us, that calls out a real burning platform need for traditional media to stake out its claim as the fourth estate, differentiated from other forms of media that people are interpreting as media. Now, we also look in the US. It's important to note that, not entirely surprisingly, trust levels do differ by voting preference. So we asked voters in the US, for those who did vote, we asked them, did you vote for President Trump or Hillary Clinton? And generally, Hillary Clinton voters are more trusting. With the media in particular, you see significantly higher trust among Hillary voters. For Trump voters, there's distrust in every institution except business. Not entirely surprising. Now, we also do break out how people are feeling in trust in traditional media versus platforms. And for platforms, we use the definition of things like social media platforms, but also search. Historically, we've seen them move in tandem, and there's been a slight increase in trust, or a slight surplus of trust in traditional media. This year, for the first time, we've seen a big gap, right? Where traditional media has held, in the US, it's held its increase over the past couple of years, and platforms have dropped significantly. And I would note that this is several months before the worst of the attention to Facebook and others was hitting the news. So we probably would expect next year that we're going to see further depletion in the platforms. But it is not all great news for traditional media. There's a significant number of people who feel that the traditional media often can have the wrong priorities. For example, sacrificing on quality of media in order to just get large audiences, or cutting corners on accuracy in order to get the scoop first or break the news, or even pursue a political agenda over the role of informing the public. So these are pretty large majorities across all of those. One of the other things we look at is voices of credibility and how people view the sources of information and their level of credibility. And a couple things to note here. For the past several years, a person like yourself has been by far the most trusted source of information around the world, followed by experts. Historically, experts were in the lead. Now we've seen that reversal. And our interpretation is that this is due to concerns about media echo chambers and fake news, and people are now, thankfully, turning back to experts as credible sources of information. However, for journalists, we've seen a good increase of 10 points this year in trust, but it's still a very low 40-something% of people trust journalists as sources of quality information. Now, a lot of what's driving the distrust in the media, not the only thing, but a lot of what's driving it, I know a big part of the conversation today is concern about fake news. And as you see, 72% of Americans respondents are concerned about fake news being used as a weapon. The global number is 70%. So this is not just a US phenomenon, but around the world, people are deeply concerned about the weaponization of news, and fake news specifically. And they're feeling a lot of uncertainty and lack of control over discerning fake news from real news. There's questions about, do they believe the average person can tell the difference? And even if they can tell the difference, do they believe that they can tell the difference of what the source of the news is? And is it a credible news agency, or is it a third party that might just be informal? And as a result of this, we're seeing around the world, and again, more acutely in the US, people are disengaging. So 55% of our respondents said they do not engage in news once a week. And only 20% engage more than once a week and actively share news. So this is, again, for the fourth estate, this is a very worrying figure. And again, the global average is 50% are disengaged. So it's a pretty universal finding. And as a result of this, people are feeling less informed. They're reading and listening and consuming media less. And they're avoiding, almost a third are actively avoiding consuming news. So there's I think, a lot to unpack in there, right? There is a lot of concern, but there's also some very positive glimmers of hope, particularly around traditional media. And so I think the conversation today is, how do we address some of these legitimate concerns, but how do we, particularly as in the mainstream media, both traditional and platforms, do a better job of building trust to maintain our role as the fourth estate. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael. We're going to call up our first panel, which will look at the issues of media. So David Folkenflik, who's the media correspondent for NPR, Paula Kerger, president of PBS, Matt Thompson, who's executive editor of The Atlantic, and Meredith Artley, who's editor-in-chief of CNN Digital worldwide. And I'm going to come and join you. So I'm going to start with David, who's been covering the media, and that's some pretty bad news that our messenger of bad news brought us. He's trying to mask it in some positive news, but that's some pretty devastating statistics about people's attitudes towards the media. Is this self-inflicted? How did this happen?
I think partly we have to acknowledge times have changed. We've had new entries here, so there's been a diminishment of centralized authority. In Walter Cronkite, everybody tunes into CBS Evening News at 6:30. You've had cable, you've had talk radio, you've had digital and instantaneous ability to check sources all over the world. These are all going to fragment our decision to turn to one network, one morning daily. There's just this incredible fragmentation, and that in and of itself is going to undermine authority and also allow people to instantaneously check versions of what they hear from different places, and that too will undermine the sense of authority, which means the sense of trust in certain kinds of outlets we've seen. We've seen an incredible array of self-inflicted wounds over the years. You can pick your own. It's a choose-your-own-adventure moment, right? But different people will choose different ones. You might choose WMDs, and the press's failure really to test and hold government claims about intelligence to account. You might choose Dan Rather and Memogate. That was a black eye that was self-inflicted. You might choose Brian Williams and the tales he told from Iraq on the air that ultimately undermined his status as the chief anchor for NBC News. There's just almost any news organization you cite are going to have elements like that taken together at a time we're all looking more critically at the press. Those things gain a certain currency and a certain momentum. I think obviously, and one of the themes we've heard over the course of this week, you're going to hear about weaponized disinformation. Whether by people or people employing armies of bots, or whether it's Russians or Chinese or people doing this for commerce. You're seeing people intentionally spreading disinformation, what we initially used to refer to as fake news before that term was hijacked for something else. I think that's part of the game as well. You've seen social media platforms that have become so dominant, I think, pursuing relevance rather than authoritativeness, that is clickiness, over trust, and that Google and Facebook and Twitter and the like have a lot to answer for about how they decide to prioritize things, what, certain variables are in their algorithms that they won't share publicly, and how they prioritize things, Google News, Facebook feed, and the like, and that the traditional media followed suit, desperately hoping for a viable digital future. And then I think the last one I'll say to set this up is I think the godfather hanging over all this for this entire time, which is about a half century, my lifetime, of an asymmetrical attack upon the press, largely, although not exclusively, from the right. For political purposes, from Richard Nixon to Donald Trump, that I think affects, the reason you've seen that 1 year drop so alarmingly in the Edelman study has something directly to do with the candidacy and the presidency of Donald Trump. And I think that you've seen, Trumpettes all over adopting that with some success and with some real damage for what we understand about the world around us. It has never, I think, been harder to be a consumer of news. It is now an aerobic activity.
So Matt, a lot of reasons given out there for the decline in trust in the press. What does that have to do with our broader democracy? Is it affecting it, or hasn't this been the case? Haven't people always wanted to shoot the messenger and have problems with the press?
So the decline in trust does not start with the Trump administration. It doesn't start in the Iraq War or in the lead up to it. In fact, you go back, you pull the lens back, and it goes back decades. Pew and Gallup have been asking questions about trust in the media for the past several decades. Gallup started asking it in the 70s. Pew took up the baton in the 80s. Gallup and Pew both have asked it in the past 2 decades about trust in the media. And since the 80s, it has this consistent pattern of this consistent declining slope. There are many factors, as David mentioned, that correlate with that decline. But one of the implications is that we can it is less and less easy for us, the press, to provide a common frame of reference for the American public. But there's another correlation that I wanted to trace that ties with this as well. And I'm going to say something controversial, but it shouldn't be controversial. There are alternative facts. It's become common to say there is no such thing as alternative facts. There are only facts and falsehoods. And in the context, I should say, in which the phrase alternative facts was popularized, it was being used to defend a falsehood. However, the mere fact that that no story can contain the sum total of the relevant facts to the issues that the story touches on, the mere fact that we have to end a story somewhere, means that there are competing sets of facts that are valid, perfectly factual, legitimate, alternative narratives for what's occurring. When I came to the Washington, D.C., where I work now for The Atlantic, I moved from Minneapolis, Minnesota. You roll back the clock 100 years, and Minneapolis was this place where the media was very different. There were 4 dailies: the Minneapolis Times, the Morning Star, the Evening Tribune, the Minneapolis Journal. There was an Irish Catholic paper, there was a Scandinavian paper, a German language paper. There were union papers, there were liberal and conservative papers. There were dozens of papers. There were dozens of agents of the media at that time. And each one of them, you could choose an outlet that spoke for you. Over time, over the course of the 20th century, that flora of different media outlets began to slowly blot out until, in 1982, the Minneapolis Times, the Journal, the Tribune, the Star, all became the paper that I worked at before I came to DC, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, in 1982. Pew started asking questions about the decline in trust in 1985, and the slope began ticking down from there. If you don't have a paper, if you don't have an outlet that you think speaks for you, then of course you're not going to treat as sacrosanct or trust necessarily to the same degree the outlets that you think speak for them. And I think that's one thing that we've got to pay attention to both as a public and as the Fourth Estate. I think we have to become more comfortable with the fact that there are alternative facts. If people see a media and they do not see themselves in it, they do not see anyone speaking a narrative that is relevant to them and holding forth a set of facts that accords with their experience, then they are going to diminish
trust.
A lot of people want to distinguish between fact and opinion. And Daniel Moynihan said everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but not to their own facts. Are you disputing that approach? Or are you, do you have a nuance on that?
I would say that, in fact, in the context in which the late senator issued that short tweetable statement, he actually meant something pretty nuanced by it. That, yes, in fact, there is a difference between fact and opinion, and there's certainly a difference between fact and falsehood. There is not one common set of facts that we can all agree upon as the relevant set of facts, and I think that it would be stretching Senator Moynihan's ideas.
But do we
to say,
now have a crisis in believability because we don't seem to have the same facts that we're talking about? We're like have alternative universes.
I would say it's never been easier for falsehood. They say the lie gets travels around the world faster than the truth gets up for breakfast. I think that's true. Falsehood has never been easier to spread. I also think that there is a value to opinion. There is a value to being able to hold multiple sets of competing facts in one's head at the same time.
So Meredith, Artley from CNN, we've heard about cable being one of the problems that has brought on, the press has brought on, and platforms. And you're CNN online. Are you the problem or are you the solution?
If I say I'm the problem, then my soul is essentially dead. I mean, we're the solution. I mean, here's what I think the solution is. I think the solution is global independent journalism and news organizations that are not working in favor of any one person, party, or government. I think the solution is trained journalists who work with an ethical code that has to do with seeking the truth and accuracy and fairness and a wide range of sources and points of view and knowing what kinds of questions to ask and knowing where to get the information that is needed. So I think the profession of journalism is a part of the solution. And you know, listen, I think being honest about when we make mistakes and being completely transparent is part of the solution. I think being very clear about corrections and clarifications and updates and changes to stories is an act of trust with your audiences and with the public. So CNN does all of those things. The news organizations represented on this stage and more do all of those things. You know, what makes CNN unique, and I understand I think I understand what's laying underneath that question of CNN as part of the problem or the solution. I do see sometimes in my inbox or my Twitter feeds or anywhere else in all caps, those moments where audiences or the public thinks that CNN is a part of the problem and not the solution. And frankly, I welcome that dialogue as long as it's threat-free, troll-free, and not full of lies. I think that's another good dialogue to have. On the cable news spectrum, when people think of CNN, that's our DNA, that's our heritage, right? You think of CNN, the network, a lot of people think of CNN TV first. CNN has CNN US, CNN International, CNN Digital on just about every screen and feed that you can be on. So CNN is truly ubiquitous in a way that many other news organizations are not. On the cable news spectrum, we try, when you think about that competitive set, which is a limited lens by which to view CNN, but it's an understandable one, and a lot of people view CNN through that lens, we try very hard to have a big tent, to have multiple points of view. So a lot of the complaints that we see about CNN being a part of the problem have to do with things like too many talking heads arguing with each other on air, right? I would argue, and sometimes it goes on a little long, and sometimes it gets a little unproductive. But I would argue that at a time like this, when there is a lack of trust, when people have fled to their corners and their filter bubbles, when people feel both more connected and more disconnected than they've ever felt, that it's really important to try to get these differing points of view. And if people argue and debate sometimes, well, that's a good thing. And sometimes we got to cut it a little shorter than maybe we do. But seriously, I just think that is something that is very important. And that I'm speaking largely about kind of the cable news landscape. Digitally, the issue is our pieces of content get atomized and pulled off. So you might see only one clip from air, or one story, or one op-ed in your feed that reinforces what you already believe, because that's how the algorithm works. And that's a problem. That is part of the problem that I think is causing this division and this trust and some of the polarization we're seeing.
Okay, so PBS generally has a pretty high level of trust, at least those who watch. And it's something I've kind of wondered about with these surveys, if people say they don't trust the media, but it might be like Congress. They don't trust Congress, but they like their congressman. It may be that they don't like the media, but they like their medium. And you have a pretty loyal following.
Yeah.
What have you done that has fostered trust in
Well, I'm happy to be on the public media side of this panel
Yeah.
with my colleague David from NPR. So I spend a lot of time on the road, and I visit stations across the country. And the thing that is most striking to me, which ties into yours but not exactly, is what has happened in journalism around the country. So it's not just not seeing, yourself reflected. You're not seeing your community reflected, exactly. Because the number of reporters that have disappeared at the local level is stunning. And that absolutely mirrors the decline in journalism. So if a story is written about you or your community, and you can pretty much tell if someone really understands that community, really understands the circumstance, or they're parachuting in from somewhere else. And I think there are a lot of great media organizations that do extraordinary work, but it is almost impossible to come into a community and understand the context of a circumstance if you need to turn around a story very quickly. So I think it is much harder for people to distrust the media if the reporters and the media organization are the same people who are standing next to you at your kid's soccer game. It's harder to trust someone that you don't know. And so the media organizations are remote. They're not getting the stories correct. And I think the solution to all of that I think many people thought is, well, the digital world, the internet is going to somehow equalize this. We'll have reporting from all over the country. Well, guess what? That didn't happen, because most of the news organizations in the digital space are also located on both coasts. And in the case of digital, there's actually that crescent that goes down through Austin, as it comes down the coast from Seattle. So I think that this whole issue of the lack of support and the lack of local journalism is really a big piece of what's happened. It's also, a lot of mischief happens when someone's not covering state politics, when someone isn't looking at, how money is being spent and holding people accountable. So I think that, for us, many of the communities I visited, our public television, public radio stations are the last remaining locally owned and operated. And I think that's why people trust us. We're in the community. We exist because of trust. People give us money to do the work that we do. They don't have to, but they do because they care about the work that we do. Now, there's lots of efforts underway to boost journalism at the local level. You've been engaged in a lot. My colleague, Jonathan Barsley, who's sitting in the back row, was part of the launch of Report for America, which is a version of Teach for America, which is an effort to really begin to see journalists back at the local level. So I think there's a lot of great work that's happening around that. But I think that the localism piece, I think for us, is really important. That is in addition to, obviously, the integrity of the work that we do, being careful not to cut corners, to invest in the kind of journalism that is about the important issues. We've been mocked for years about, the NewsHour not exactly being the sexiest place. David Brooks, if you saw him last night, even made a joke about his own home. It's okay. I wear it proudly because their job is not to be entertainment. Jim Lehrer knew it when he created the NewsHour, and every person that works for that news organization understands it's news. And so I think that, so I'm echoing everything that everyone has said on this panel. It's the integrity of the work. but it is also really the focus on making sure that journalists are in places covering the stories so that communities are truly reflected, not just people's opinions.
Okay, so let's dig down into that a little bit. But first, Meredith is one of the Knight Commission commissioners, and we've looked at these questions, and we're seeing a perfect storm. This perfect storm is that local journalism has lost a good deal of its business model that, due to platforms taking a lot of the advertising, and they've cut back in their journalists, which has not helped them gain trust. We have a polarized society that we're facing right now, and the technology of many to many. So we have sources of information constantly coming into us, and that this is causing a very significant issue for local journalism, that it's becoming more and more difficult, as you've raised. And I think a University of North Carolina study just said 200 news deserts, where there's nothing in those communities that is really bringing about local news. So let's be a little more optimistic in the next 5 to 10 minutes about what are some things that we can do and that people here can do that can foster and remove those deserts, irrigate those deserts with journalists. So anybody want to, Matt, you look like you're...
I think paying attention to them, I mean, I think that's one thing, that our attention, we live in an attention economy. Our attention decides a lot of what happens in the mediascape. And we are implicated in that as citizens, in the media that we consume, that we pursue, that we support with our dollars. And I think attention is one of the most valuable things. I see so many unasked and unanswered questions in every city, and it's not just the decline of local media, it's also the decline of an ethnic press. It's also the decline of investigative resources in different communities. Journalists who can take different angles, different avenues of a story and pursue them. I think that we have to be able to pay attention to not just what's happening at the national level, not just the thrilling, incredibly colorful set of characters that are currently driving our national politics, but also the ordinary, more quotidian challenges, the day-to-day questions that we as a society have to grapple with one another on our streets, in our neighborhoods, in our schools, in our churches. I think that these factors are entangled with one another. I would say the perfect storm is a perfect storm of things that all reinforce one another. And I think that one of the elements that is important is that we find ways to be reinvested in what's happening all around us.
David, are you finding some examples of local journalism that are blossoming and give you, particular hope? Texas Tribune is one that we've seen a lot in Austin. Of course, it is Austin, but
we love Evan.
Yeah, but are there some areas where you see somebody's doing something different that?
I think you can look around at Berkeley. There's a new place that has sort of raised money in sort of a small. With a corporate structure that is designed to be able to raise money and still make a slight profit, I believe. In Baltimore, there have been sites up from people from my old shop, the Baltimore Sun. There are places where people are trying to find homes for the ambitions and for the need for coverage. I remember when Politico was relatively young and they were talking about their ambitions. They said they were going to have presences in all 50 capitals, and that didn't happen. They have a couple people in Florida, a couple people other places, but just simply didn't happen. And I'm concerned about the idea that there's going to be a financial structure to sustain that organically. I think that people are going to have to find ways. I think public media is a wonderful model, but not the only model. I think Texas Tribune is great, but may not work in all areas that doesn't have a backer like John down there in Austin to fund it. But I think people are going to have to come forward to really find ways to support media. And I think that those places are going to have to do work that's trusted. We're going to also have to embrace at times organizations that you don't think of as journalistic. Human Rights Watch does some excellent reporting. There are health organizations that do excellent reporting. The question is, are they honest brokers of the information they have? Is their information tested? Are they responsive and transparent about how they get information? Are they behaving with certain kinds of journalistic imperative for the information they provide? And I think we need that on a local level. I'm a faculty brat. My parents both retired academics. I've been waiting for universities to unleash the incredible intellectual capital they have and to be better, honest brokers of information, sometimes against interest, sometimes against the conclusions, but nonetheless to provide people with information on a more consistent level that they can use. Let me put in a brief plug. I don't speak for NPR. I don't get to make decisions at NPR. I think they're probably pretty happy about that. I get to cover them sometimes. But let me make a brief pitch for what I think of as public radio and NPR at its best, which is a place where people's voices are heard in their own words, in their own actual voices. I think that's so important. I go around and talk all around the country to listeners and at public events, and that's something they actually get something out of. And there is debate, sometimes spirited. It is, at its best, it's civil with an edge. And I think that's a good model. People recognize themselves. It is both a place for muscular journalism when we do it right, and for engaged debate where communities play things out in front of each other's ears. And I think that's a worthwhile way of thinking about what we can do in this sort of hyper-entangled age.
I can only be optimistic so long. Beat journalism, enterprise journalism costs money, and newsrooms are cutting back. They have to cut back somewhere. A lot of them, and we've seen with the Denver Post, the staff basically protesting against the management, which is a hedge fund or investment fund that is taking the money and cutting back in journalism. Is this business model doomed? Is the local business model doomed? And do we have to go to public broadcasting in a way? Do we have to go to philanthropy? Do we need to look at local journalism organizations like we look at arts organizations and support them as citizens and as philanthropists?
Can we briefly acknowledge that what happens in Denver and Boulder and other places owned by that organization and similar ones, none of it's foreordained. It doesn't have to work like that. These are conscious choices. People are making conscious choices to extract money from often profitable journalistic operations. They weren't profitable the way they once were, where people thought 15% profit margins was kind of a bad year, but they're profitable. These are conscious choices. So people get to decide if they're going to stand by, allow that to happen. People are going to decide whether or not they want to invest in industries. You've seen in Minneapolis, in Boston, at the Washington Post, places, here, Mr. Jobs, there are people who are deciding to invest and figure out ways to both infuse money into journalistic operations and also find sustainable models for it that don't have to be avaricious. These are not the ways you get rich, but they can be in the black.
Meredith?
We need a menu of shared best business models that support journalism at the local, regional, and sometimes national and global level, right? That is something that is beginning to take shape, and there are a couple of different models that have been mentioned up here that are an option. I think the point about being in communities is hugely important. I think the other thing that's really important, and I can express some optimism if I dare on this point, is who we hire and who we promote to tell the stories that need to be told. And I've been working really hard at CNN, and I'm surrounded with a bunch of leaders who are committed to this too, to make sure that we are hiring people with a diverse range, diversity in every single way that you can think of it, diverse range of backgrounds and views. I do think that is part of the reason that we're seeing some of the trust chipped away at, because some of the public doesn't see themselves represented in our coverage and what we're doing. The head of the Me Too movement said that she often tells Black women and other minority communities that the mainstream media will never tell your story. They have never told your story. So just go out and tell your own story. This is fascinating to me, right? Because yes, people should tell, they can, the technology is there, they can and should tell their own story. But to me, that's a clarion call to say, and I can point to examples of where we do this every day and we do it well, but they're just examples. And until we try and make that the air we breathe and the way that it works, then that will help the business model, and it will be doing right by the stories that need to be told in the communities and places and the people that need their stories told.
And to couple that with what you said earlier about standards, Meredith, when I think back to my time working for local newspapers in Fresno and Minneapolis, and I see the process that our stories go through at the Atlantic, I wish that every community had that. Standards are important. Depth is important. It was a constraint of the media in the prior age. It was a constraint of our newspapers that we had to put the Metro story up every single day, whether or not we had the goods. And similarly, it is a privilege of us at a magazine where we can spend the time to do the work that people do immensely value. The stories that we tell at The Atlantic, the most intensely reported, the stories of people's lives. One of our stories that ran in the July-August issue of the magazine, the reporter put in 40 interviews to make the pitch for the story to be greenlit. I wish that every community had access to that depth.
So we've talked about enhancing local journalism sort of through new, maybe some new financial plans, business plans. We've talked about increasing diversity so that it's people like you. One thing we haven't touched on, but we have 1 minute and 30 seconds to do, so Paula, is on transparency. That's an area that our Knight Commission has focused on as another area where we think there might be a means of increasing trust. Have you thought about that?
We think about that a lot, and I think one of the people that I think has been at the forefront of a lot of this work is Rainey Aronson, who is the executive producer of Frontline, who uses the digital platforms to not only put up the full interviews so that you can look at the documentary and then you can go back and actually look at the interviews and make your own decision about whether they made the right choices and how the doc was cut. I think transparency is huge, and what goes hand in glove with that is media literacy. And I think that's the other piece I think that is hugely important. I think during this time of great distrust, I think organizations like mine and David's and others benefit by being brands that have been built on trust, and part of that is because of our whole economic structure of being supported by philanthropic contributions. And I think that the transparency of the work that we do, I think every journalistic organization needs to think about what that looks like and how we can use, I'm not running out the clock, and how we can use the platforms that are at disposal, particularly the digital platforms, in order to give the reader and the viewer a greater insight into the work itself.
Terrific. Let's join me in thanking our first panel. Who said, you know, we're in an attention economy. And let me just say that one of the most profound, I thought, one of the most profound comments as this Knight Commission has gone around the country and heard from people was somebody in Silicon Valley who said, at a certain point, social networks became social media. And the reason I thought that was significant was a social network looks at every person, every node is a person, and every node is the customer. Social media, every person on the network is the product being sold to advertisers. So it's a different business model. I'm not saying it's bad by any means. It's been very successful, and it has fueled this, this social network. But it is an element of the attention economy, and maybe you can kick us off. And why is the attention economy significant in this discussion?
Well, I'm willing to say that it can be a bad business model, especially for something we call news. That it is a business model, the one you described, the resale of human attention. But that when it comes particularly to the subject of news gathering, telling the truth and trying to figure out what is really going on, that it has always, for a very long time, had a dangerous influence, I think, having a purely ad-supported business model. So I want to sort of try to give a big, maybe 10 or 100,000 view on what has happened, why we're here talking. I think a lot of it, as the last panel already indicated, has to do fundamentally with business models. And I think a lot of it has to do with the ascendance of a particular business model associated with the internet age. One of the things that, if you want to boil down what has changed about the news media from the 20th to the 21st century, I would point my finger at a reversal in the scarcity of information. That is to say, you know, there was once upon a time when it was, you know, hard to get news or and hard to produce or create something you could call news, and you know, in fact, it was hard. Entertainment was also pretty scarce too, and people actually were bored sometimes, which I don't remember that anymore. You know, you constantly, and now we're in an environment where things have flipped, where information is extremely abundant. You know, you can, even while you're listening to me, look up 10 different things. And the fundamental implication of that flip is that when information becomes abundant, it's attention that becomes scarce. It's attention that becomes the most valuable resource. It's attention that becomes, in fact, one of the last scarce resources there is once people have everything else. And so the competition for that 168 hours that we each have every week becomes more and more intense. And you probably notice this in your life. You know, how many times a day is something trying to get you to just pay a little tiny bit of attention to it? You know, no one's got you for sure for hours. It's like everybody's fighting. It's incredibly competitive. And I think that, you know, to sort of wrap this up, has had the effect on the news media that we've seen. So the tech platforms are the kings of the attention economy. They have mastered the art of figuring out exactly what is going to make you pull your phone out and click on it, like I see some people already doing. You know, they have this kind of, they've been great in engineering a system that has taken up so much of attention that the traditional media industries are now fighting over this, like, whatever crumbs are left over. You see what I mean? So they won. So I know I'm going on a little bit
you're
longer.
fine.
Yeah.
But there's another aspect of the attention economy that does relate to the news purveyors, which is that in order to get attention, what is it that gets attention?
Yeah.
The sensational, the extreme, the appeal to fear, the
Right.
appeal to anger.
Right. So
So how does that?
So you're fighting over these crumbs, and you know, in a competition that's purely for attention, the race usually goes to the most lurid, absurd, provocative. It's been very interesting to look at the studies to see what people forward. And you know, there's long studies of like what kind of articles get forwarded. And it depends on hitting arousal emotions. You know, you hit something, you see this, you get angry, and you feel like you have to tell other people about it. Or sometimes you feel very impressed, and you know, some science stories. But they have to constantly hit on these arousal emotions. You know, BuzzFeed's an organization that began as BuzzFeed Laboratories. Their only mission was trying to see how do we poke the right emotions so we get forward. So I think that has affected all of news. It's dragged the rest of news media into that area, maybe with the exception of PBS and NPR, dragged them towards feeling they have to be in this competition. And I think this sort of rise of the attention economy and of that need to be lured. I do think there are cures to this problem, but I think this is a diagnosis. Sorry for going on so long.
No, it's fine. Nuala, you've dealt with this techlash that's been going on. The people all of a sudden have, instead of loving their platform, whichever one it might be, there's been a big reaction. And it's really after the 2016 election, it's after this pervasiveness of fake news and people feeling like they're being taken advantage of, and they're turning to the platforms. And I'm hearing more and more, let's regulate them. So how do you regulate them?
Let's start with the whether we should question, not how.
Okay.
But I think Charlie looks at me as a Washington-based nonprofit lawyer and says, oh, like, I've got a hammer and everything looks like a nail, everything has to be regulated. I would step back and ask the question first, which I ask my very young, very idealistic team all the time. What's new, what's different, and how are we going to make it better? Meaning, some of the things Tim talked about are profoundly new and different in scope, scale, velocity, volume. But newspapers were ad-supported. Radio was ad-supported. Television was ad-supported. So the very premise that just because it's ad-supported means it's bad is not, I think, borne out by history. And I think we all need to be students of history. If you look back at the kinds of really volatile press coverage of Hamilton and Jefferson, right? I mean, I love the show Hamilton. Who's seen Hamilton? Yes. That's a whole other story. Saw it the third week it was open on Broadway.
Do you need to brag on this?
Yes, whatever
The
happens
last
in
part
my
of the
life,
session is going to be in song.
whatever happens in my life, I can say I saw the third week it was open on Broadway, at the original cast. But if you look back at our history, there have been other periods of time where the news coverage was volatile and horrific. It is not necessarily the fault of the internet that that behavior exists. The question I ask to our tech platform leaders is, what is your responsibility? What is your ethical duty of care, not only to the individuals you ostensibly serve, but to the democracy itself? And Tim does make a very good point that the algorithmic decision-making that was profoundly well-suited in the 1990s when I was working in internet advertising to sell you more of what you have searched for. You've gone to look for a red sweater is going to stalk you across every website that you visit, right? We kind of understand, I hope, the commercial interest there. That is a valid, I think, use of the institutional relationship. However, those principles, those values are profoundly unsuited to create an informed electorate, to educate and foster good dialogue in a democracy. And so the question, I think the very hard question for the platforms is, what is your corporate social responsibility? What is your corporate civic responsibility in the digital age? Just as old line industrial companies had to clean up the Hudson River and think about their environmental impact, what is your data impact and what is the impact you're having on society? And I think we are in an era of transformation. Some very wise woman said at lunch to me that it is not unlike the Industrial Revolution. It is disruptive, it is horrific for some people, and it is a time of change. We are only part of the way through this maturity model for tech, and you're right, we are in the middle of a tech lash. Whether you were happy or sad with the outcome of the US election or of Brexit or are concerned about Cambridge Analytica, the use of your personal data to make decisions about you is having profound effects on your understanding of your democracy.
So let's take the function of moderation, which is essentially how a network is formed. That there's some function of moderation. And people are saying, well, how did they let all these false stories and foreign countries influence our election? Why didn't they stop it? Should there be some form of required moderation? And is that a foul of the First Amendment if it's required? And second, do we want government censorship in that sense? Do we want corporate censorship? Is that better or worse? Or do we want no censorship, which may be worse itself?
Well, I would start with the premise that, first of all, content moderation at scale is hard. I concede that. You are talking about millions and hundreds of millions of transactions a day, and ferreting out image-based or word-based content is actually hard, and the potential to take down, and I think this was covered in an earlier panel, a disproportionate number of non-English speakers or affected parties or underrepresented groups is very serious. It's a very serious concern, and I recognize that. However, the question was also asked earlier in this event, do bots have First Amendment rights? And I hope we can all agree that bots do not have First Amendment rights, right? And so there are lots of kind of content agnostic ways to make platforms better. And I do give credit to the companies that are working on these things. I think, again, we have a long way to go. And I think in the United States, we will take, as we do in data privacy, a sectoral approach, and we will look at very significant harms, as we've looked at in sex trafficking or terrorist content or the most malicious and hateful content. We will probably not take an omnibus comprehensive approach, as we've done in Europe with the right to be forgotten or the GDPR. There are different ways of handling this that reflect cultural values, but I think we all have a duty of care. I am very taken with the Jack Balkin construct of information fiduciary. What is your fiduciary or custodial duty of care to the information you purvey, to the information you collect about individuals, and how it is used?
Great. So I'm going to move to a slightly different area, which is I've always felt that if we demanded good government, we'd get it. That the individual is the atom of democracy and the component of democracy, and that we as individuals are responsible for a great deal. And Charlie, you've talked about a crisis in citizenship.
There's a new survey out so that half of Americans think there's a real danger of becoming a non-democratic authoritarian country. And I think they're right about that. I mean, I think that we we don't have a crisis just of the media and just of technology. We have a crisis of citizenship. You know, and we've been talking about this for so long, the fake news, the bots, and by the way, it's not just alternative facts. We have created alternative reality silos. I think I agreed with everything the first panel said. I just think it's way worse than what you said. I think that one of the things that is dawning on us is that America is not immune to history. That in fact our institutions are more fragile than we thought they are. And if we blame it on Facebook or blame it on Google, I'm not letting anybody off the hook here. If we blame it on this technology, I think we're missing the fact that, going back to this, you know, it is up to us. We are paying the price for the neglect of civic education. A country whose citizenry is ignorant, indifferent, and disengaged is not going to preserve democracy. It is just not going to happen. Some of the numbers in the Edelman survey about the number of people who are disengaged, I mean, ought to be really alarming to all of us, what we're actually up to here. So, in fact, while we should focus on the platforms, yeah, thank you.
You probably didn't hear anything I said before, right?
But now you can start saying something that's relevant.
You know, now I will actually address the question. No, but I do think this question of, we have all of this misinformation, all of this atomization of news. But then the question is, you know, that's the supply side. Why are so many Americans gullible? Why are so many Americans ignorant of these fundamental principles? We talk about democratic norms. We talk about all the rule of law. And then we come to an event like this and we find out, you know what, most Americans either don't know what we're talking about, aren't paying attention to what we're talking about, or who may not care about it. So ultimately, the crisis of citizenship is what makes us exceptional as a country. Is it our politicians? Is it the documents? Or is it this tradition of citizenship, responsible citizenship, civic literacy, media literacy, all of which I think is being exposed by what's happening right now. Now, I'm not letting anybody off the hook here. But if we're honest about it, you know, Donald Trump did not create this environment. He's clearly an actor, but he's also a symptom. And I think that a lot of what's happening in American politics is a reflection on us. And if we're waiting for somebody on the white horse to come in and come up with a model that suddenly makes us smarter and care more about what is truth. And one last point about, you know, it's not just a matter of, I mean, they're not coming, by the way. So, but that, you know, lying politicians and propaganda is not a new thing. What is possibly new for Americans is having a citizenry that will hear those lies and the propaganda, know that it may not be true, and actually not care. That's the problem, that you need to have an educated, serious electorate that will hold its leaders and its media to high standards and actually cares about these things. I would love to say that we have that, but we don't. So all the criticism of the media, I think, is, and the discussions that we're having are completely relevant. I do think, and unfortunately, I'm probably at the alarmist end of this spectrum, that I do think that that survey that showed that a majority of Americans think that their democracy is at risk, I think that they are getting something. That, in fact, we've been drawing down this reservoir of democratic values for years and years and years, relying upon it, but at some point that reservoir is emptied. And then as a nation, we are fundamentally screwed. And I'm not sure that there's any institution that's going to be able to fix that if we don't have a revival of the concept of citizenship and that shared sense of purpose and values.
Great. So we've gotten out the issue of, are we the problem? Are platforms the problem? Are media themselves the problem? We haven't really gotten into, is the government the problem, but maybe we could. But Tim, you've thought about this a great deal. You're one of our great thinkers in this sphere, and have some ideas of solutions.
Yeah, I want to play off what you're saying, because I couldn't agree with you more. I think that you're right. I think in a republic, as opposed to a monarchy or dictatorship, the idea is that the citizens have to be able to think for themselves. They have to have certain levels of virtue and education. And If we're not going to have that, we might as, I mean, you can see the clear path to being run by some strong man who says that he knows better for us and we just all accept it. You know, I was kind of disturbed by the fact that the most trusted, country has the most trusted media is China, which suggests that, you know, there's some part where you shoot the moon where someone does say, listen, I've got it all, I've got it figured out, listen to me, this is the way it is. And, you know, this country tried to choose a different course, but we're, as you say, not handling it very well. The only thing I'll maybe suggest is that I think it's a function, you know, all of how we are in media literacy is function of both what we do, but also the environment we are in. You know, they play off against each other. But I do think that I want to try to bring some optimism, because I do believe, even in a panel like this, even in, you know, how much is written on this, that people have started to think there is a problem here. That, you know, there is this idea of collective self-government. It's been going for a while, but actually something really maybe is going off the rails for once. And if there's one thing about the United States, which I think is really special about the United States that is sometimes ignored, is its capacity to react and repair. I sometimes think that that's one fabulous thing about this country, is it is capable of realizing its weaknesses and coming back. It's like every Hollywood movie. Maybe there's a reason every Hollywood movie is like that. You know, there is a down before there's a recovery. And I think people are starting, you know, to realize, for example, if they want to have better media, they actually have to pay for it. You know, I am somewhat heartened by the fact that the PBS, NPR, the New York Times digital model, that people are actually out there saying, listen, we're doing good journalism, support us, and people are supporting them. And I find that to be, you know, uplifting. Now, big things start small hasn't solved all of our problems, but some of what you're talking about, I think, interacts with this question of attention and how we spend it. So let me put it onto this. So part of the problem, I think, is that most of us have just kind of blindly gotten used to clicking on whatever comes first, and that's what we think is news. Mainly because a lot of this is new. Social media is new. It's kind of exciting. It's unbelievable. You can see 6 cats who failed so hard they won, and you didn't realize that. And it takes a different kind of self-discipline, you know, to train yourself to read full articles, a different kind of discipline, not to spend a whole afternoon clicking on articles about 90s celebrities. And it's something, a muscle we're trying to train, and that is the kind of citizenship muscle. Frankly, citizenship in our time is about how you spend your attention. You know, it's about how you allocate this resource. Do you spend it all reading about the latest fiasco I mean, you should spend some in Washington, or do you spend trying to figure out what's going on with local candidates in local news? I mean, you can put all the stuff out there, but if no one actually has the internal dedication to doing this, we won't fix the democracy. So I think we're learning a set of new skills related to citizenship. That is the challenge of the coming decade. But I actually have some faith we can do it. I have a faith there's a lot of, in some central way, good-tempered, well-meaning people who really want to preserve this democracy.
What about, let's move to, again, this area of the platforms that I think people have, and we'll get out to questions shortly because we'll try to make this more interactive. But people are saying, well, what about competition to these platforms? How do you create more competition? Because they seem dominant. We know we have a few players who are quite dominant, and network economics are, the bigger you are, the more efficient it is to connect to that network. And so it's kind of a winner-take-all or winner-take-most economy. That's
right.
a network principle.
This is a very hard question, because the question is whether concentration makes the media environment worse or better, right? And that's fun. I mean, I'm a Louis Brandeis devotee, so I'm always on the side of local and decentralized media. And it's part of why I think an antitrust law, I'm an antitrust professor as well, is a part of this, that you need to have a certain kind of decentralization of power. And part of that is in the big platforms. In other words, I'm saying maybe we got to break up some of the big platforms that have gotten too much a share of certain lines of business.
Let's take Facebook. If you broke Facebook up into 5 companies, wouldn't one of them grow back to be Facebook?
I don't really think that's true. I think that, well, right now, WhatsApp and Instagram, we get into this, WhatsApp, Instagram.
Well, that's different. I'm talking about the
well, they're
actual
actually owned by Facebook.
No, I know. No, but I mean, I'm not saying spin off those entities. I'm saying the Facebook network.
Yeah.
You know, so if you were to break up a single network, wouldn't it kind of, one of them grow back to be the network?
I
Nuala?
think the bigger concern for the big platforms are people like my 13-year-old daughter, who says, Mom, nobody's on Facebook, right? That's really the concern. These oligopolies rise and fall with the speed of light now, and I'm less concerned. I know there is a big push, and like I said, everybody with the hammer thinks everything is a nail among the antitrust bar to think about traditional classical antitrust and competition law, and I think there's merit to exploring that. I think there's particularly merit to exploring the nexus between competition and data, because the holdings of the network effect mean the more data and the more personal data the network has, the more inferences and algorithmic decision-making it can make about you and your friends and others. But I'm not convinced that that alone is what is going to save us from the power structure of a Facebook. And I also think that the personal agency and dignity that we would seek, and I'd point you all to the California ballot initiative and the roiling debate that's going on in the California legislature. It's a hot mess this week, and it's potentially the first somewhat comprehensive privacy law in the United States at the state level, following some of the principles of the European model. But I think reducing the power asymmetry between the individual and the platform as to not only their own data, but their own holdings, and recognizing an individual interest in the data is another way to level the playing field. And that would sweep in all actors, not just penalize or cement the largest platforms in their network.
And would you allow for some kind of portability of your?
I'm all about portability and deletion. I can go deeply wonky on the principles, but the idea is that I have some ongoing interest in my self-expression online, my pictures, my alphanumeric data, my self-awareness. That doesn't mean I don't give some assets to Facebook. I'm hugely on Facebook and Twitter, by the way. You can all follow me. But I have some continuing interest. I brought my cell phone not only because I'm attached to it like it's an appendage, but because I've been walking around not only with the CDT logo, but a little sticker that says, "Get a warrant," on it for about 5 years. Yes, it's that old. And as you all know, the Supreme Court just held in the Carpenter case that the federal government does need to get a warrant for location-based tracking of cell phone data, which is a good step in the right direction. You were asking about regulation, Charlie, and there are lots of ways to regulate human and institutional behavior. I don't want to wait another 15 years for a Supreme Court case, because that's a little behind the 8 ball of technology innovation, but there are many, many ways, factors, including media scrutiny and public sentiment, that can change behavior overnight, as we've seen.
So in our last question for this panel, let's go back to the question of false news, misinformation, disinformation, intentional trying to dupe the public. What would you do to resolve this question? This is really, I think, on so many people's mind. Maybe start with Charlie.
Well, I think the real tragedy of the last several years has been the fact that we had this inundation of false, misleading information that rather than, I think, address it in a serious and comprehensive way, it was, I think David used the term, it was hijacked to try to discredit and delegitimize all fact-based media, which, by the way, is also a sign of the sickness of our democracy. That, in fact, that we have not addressed that particular problem. Look, the mainstream media, and by the way, when we talk about media, I'm just not sure that a lot of the people that answer the surveys even know what the terms mean anymore. And when I talk about fact-based media, I have a specific idea in mind. Who knows what people who answer the surveys are thinking about it. But what a reminder, though, that credibility is the main asset that we all have, and that it is easily squandered through error and through bias. So what has to happen is somehow the restoration of the trusted source on both sides of the political spectrum that are willing to call out the false information. We do not have that right now. There's a real asymmetry where if CNN makes a mistake, they will admit we made a mistake. If the Trump administration makes a mistake, it will never, ever, ever admit that. And will there be people who are trusted on both sides of the spectrum, the 40% living in that alternative reality, who in fact will say, that is false, that is untrue? And of course, then the question is, do Americans really care whether something is true or false? I mean, this is the baseline. This is where I take the alarmist point of view.
Well,
Hannah Arendt has written about this, that at a certain point, there is that mixture of gullibility and cynicism, where it's not that you believe the false story or that you believe this or that, it's that your ability to actually engage in critical thinking has been totally eroded. That's the real danger to democracy.
Yeah, that's
I'm
right.
glad you called out the differences between misinformation. Go ahead, applaud for Charlie, because I think he's worth it. Yes. Misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. They're all. I think the solutions need to be different depending on what the source is. And let's call it what it is. Fake news is too cute a term, and it's completely out of vogue now in academic circles. But in fake news or misinformation that is promulgated by an external government is propaganda. We need to call it what it is and really talk about the source. Thank you. Finally got some applause. Commercially based stuff that's coming out of some shop in the Ukraine because some guy thinks they're going to make more money on clicks. That's a different problem and may have a different set of tools. And then what is both the greatest asset and the greatest weakness of the internet, that it has democratized voice and that everything looks like the New York Times if you put it in the right font. That is a challenge, and I think that's where the platforms can step up and start thinking about what their responsibility is to differentiate.
And while I think the platforms are constantly changing their algorithms, it is a moving target. They're constantly trying to address some of these questions. Tim?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's overstated, maybe wrong, is the idea that this problem is sort of impossible to solve. I think that gets out there. As you were saying, it is propaganda. Some of it's even particular species of propaganda, like atrocity propaganda, where you just sort of invent vicious lies about people. Like the whole Pizzagate scandal or so forth, to try to hurt their reputation. But there are, outlets, even websites, do not have fake news problems. And for me, it goes down to the business models. I don't mean to pick on the platforms too much, but they kind of wandered into this news area. They were kind of tech companies. They said, hey, this is another kind of information. People seem to like it. Well, they seem to like that. Give them more of what they want. And a lot of rumor and propaganda propagates better than news, and so it gets clicked on more and more, and this was discussed earlier. So it takes kind of an ethical determination, not a business determination, to stop fake news. It's like Wikipedia doesn't have a fake news problem, even though it's a website full of crazy users. They don't even have any paid people, or just a few.
Oh, it does. Sometimes it does.
But they manage to handle it way much better.
What happens if it's the whole country that has a fake news problem? What does the media do when you have a president who lies on a regular basis? What happens when the President of the United States uses his bully pulpit to put out flat-out misinformation? This has almost broken the media model because, of course, the right thing to do is say, yes, the president said this, it is a lie, but of course that then feeds into the, see, you have a bias, but what is the alternative? We haven't figured out how to actually handle misinformation propaganda as frankly, not just as a business model, but as the governing driving principle of the governing principle and a political principle.
Charlie's right. This is a very deep problem. This is propaganda problem, and it has been over history successfully been used by many countries that are converted into dictatorships. And and usually the long-term solution, short-term solution, you vote someone out of office. Long-term, they're conquered by another power, have a revolution. So that's a very dark way of putting it. But I have to say that
that's what I bring to the discussion.
You're talking You're talking the big stakes.
Yeah. Okay, so let's make this, we're in an era of interactive media. Let's have an interactive meeting. And what I would like for you to do is identify yourself, and you can make a statement. You don't need to ask a question, but just make it short. Right here.
One of the biggest complaints that I hear when I'm around different cities is that we're not getting news anymore that's non-biased. We're getting editorials and opinions. Can you comment on that?
Oh, and by the way, we want our first panelists also to be a part of this. And do you still have mics? No. Okay, here, let's bring a hand mic, because I think that's one that maybe one of you all could answer.
I'll take it. Yeah, listen, I hear that complaint too. I think CNN is doing some of the best journalism we've ever done. And because of this disruptive environment, we are doing classical investigative work, more digging, more fact-checking, going back to the very essence and roots of journalism, mixed with modern technology and the platforms and all of those things. We make a real effort to label news and opinion everywhere that it might appear. We are ubiquitous, so we're everywhere. And by the way, I'm sorry for all the app alerts that we send. But we hear this complaint, but I feel like a part of the role of news organizations like CNN is to provide some of these insights and commentary and thoughtful observations about this remarkable moment that we're living through right now. So my take is, as long as we label it clearly, we're good, and we should just make it clear. Yeah, David.
David, and then Paula is also wants.
Just very quickly, I'm sure that a lot of news organizations, particularly locally, have encouraged. Sorry. Hi, my name's Dave. I'm a first-time speaker here today, or not. I think that there may be an emphasis in local media to encourage people to have hot takes, to have opinions. It's quicker, it's easier, it's more reflexive. Sometimes it's valuable. I think the real danger is that news organizations locally that have had their finances hollowed out have less to offer the readers. There's less of a reason to pay a digital subscription at all, or the raised, hiked print costs when you're not covering city hall, council hall, county schools, local sports. Even in Los Angeles Times was my hometown paper, wasn't covering all of the major professional sports leagues. I think Meredith can talk to that too. Like literally, you had sports leagues hiring former newspaper writers so that their teams would be written about and read about locally. And not simply a little AP story somewhere about an inch long. So I think that's actually the greater threat, but people do complain about bias because the sparse news they see may be disproportionately have the opinions or be collating things from all over. I'm sorry.
I'm just going to add on to this very quickly. I think that media organizations have absolutely played into this because I think that media organizations do point of view and they do news. And I think you have to keep them totally separate. I would add beyond just the labeling it. I think you are in the news business and you stay in that lane, or you're in the point of view business, and you can do both as a media organization, but I think you can't jump back and forth between the two. I think that's just fed the problem.
Well, what about journalists who appear on panels expressing their opinions?
I think that opinions have to be earned. I think, so I work at a magazine. The work that we do is deeply reported analytical journalism that does come from an individual's perspective, but it is built on an iceberg of tremendous reporting and fact-checking and editing. It is built on a process that says that when we are expressing an analytical statement, when we are saying something, it is built on evidence. I think that it has to be earned, and I think that in the work that we do, we have to be transparent enough and accountable enough to our readers and to our sources and to the public at large to make sure that we are telegraphing to our audiences, these are the facts that what you are reading is built upon.
Okay, but let's see how many we've got. Okay, so quickly, because we have a lot of questions, we've got 10 minutes.
I have a very different perspective on this. You asked about the mixture of opinion and news. We have not addressed the whole question of media bias and the question of, and how much media bias has played into the decline in all of this. And yes, it is decades old. I mean, frankly, conservatives were complaining about media bias going back into the 1950s and the 1960s. And the reality is, a lot of it was legitimate. Now, I say this as somebody who was in the conservative media and as a conservative talk show host. And one of the extraordinary phenomena that I saw was how a lot of the local media just simply decided they were going to ignore all the conservatives in southeastern Wisconsin, which basically meant that they had to go someplace else. And as I said, I think at one of the night meetings, smugness and condescension are not good business models. Ignoring political views. And so I do think that the media does need to engage in this introspection. Part of the problem, this goes to the fake news. So I had been a critic of the media because I wanted it to get better. But as the misinformation and the fake news started flowing in 2016, I always tried to push back and say, okay, that's not true. No, Hillary Clinton is not running a thing in the pizza parlor. That's not happening. And here's the source of it. And what I realized that people were not accepting that information anymore because they had bailed because of the perception of bias, and we had succeeded, I guess, in totally delegitimizing much of the media. So that loss of credibility contributed to the loss of the immunity system. The conservatives lost their willingness to go to fact-based media to be able to counter the fake news. But my sense is that up until Trump, there was remarkably little serious introspection on the part of the news media about bias and their contribution to this loss of trust.
Okay. And there's a bunch of people out there, so let's try to get them out there. And I probably should be doing that while somebody else is answering. So after him, let's have the person in front of him after. So you have both.
Hi, I'm Victoria from Bezos Scholar Program. I was wondering if you would think it would be helpful to would be helpful to increase the public engagement and trust to have a resource that ranks the various media sources in terms of their transparency and fact-checking, et cetera, similar to what Charity Navigator has done for charities.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's one of the things I think is that it's easier than people say to find out what is fake news and what isn't. There's a company called NewsGuard. They kind of just started. Gordon Krovitz of the Wall Street Journal is running this through.
Stephen Brill. Stephen Brill.
Yeah, and he and I ideologically don't agree, but I agree with what he's doing, which is he's just taken a whole bunch of journalists and assessed every single outlet there is along a series of criteria as to do they follow, conspicuous practices. It's almost like, does this restaurant, keep their kitchen clean or not? Like, do they or not, or are they way off? And, it gives obvious things like RT, the Russian television network, is a red flag because it's a propaganda agent, it's a propaganda outlet. But, people don't always get that. And I think that is first doable. People are doing it, but should become an important part of this conversation.
Any other thoughts? I think there's a person out there who was right in front of the last. No, not anymore? Okay, let's try this one over here.
Hey everybody, I'm Lori Patton, I'm president of Middlebury College, and I just want to thank all the panelists, they're fantastic. And I want to just put two things together. One is this idea of being fiduciaries of information, which you introduced. And David, something you said earlier about universities and colleges as honors brokers of information. And I want to make a plea for everybody on these two panels to help universities and colleges create digital citizens. It is our biggest challenge, what we need to do. I loved what you were saying, Charlie. We have this weird space where our incentive structures for our professors don't create very many public scholars. They are consumers and reactors of media, and then they are curators of their own private research. So we need to commit to a better job of creating public scholars. But we also need, I would say, ubiquitous and really vibrant partnership between the academy and the media, because we need your help in creating digital citizens. So thank you very much.
And we need your expertise that is in the university community. Yeah. Let's go over here, over there. Yes?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Minyan Tolan. I'm the head of diversity and inclusion at Amnesty International. And I was curious, as we were going through the conversations, it's actually a question for you, Michael, about the data and how the different demographics show different patterns, specifically when it comes to rural or urban, or different generations, or different race or ethnicities around these issues.
So you're asking about just different demographic cuts?
Yes.
Yeah, so we see some differences along age. And interestingly, the younger the cohorts are the more trusting. And there's also differences in ethnicity. And I don't have them off the top of my head, but we do a deep dive on ethnic minorities, and we cut all of those. So I'd be happy to share some of the findings. But you absolutely do see more trust among the coasts in the US, as you would expect, than you do in the heartland. And you see differences in age groups, and you also see differences in trust in ethnicities. So Caucasian, higher trust levels generally than the minority populations.
I just wanted to amplify that a little bit and talk about gender and race-based usage of the platforms. If you followed any of the Guardian work on Twitter and some of the research about how particularly men and women, but also people of color, tweet and retweet and the difference, I've been beating up on Facebook now for a couple of months, so I'm going to go easy on them and talk about my distaste for the Twitter algorithm, which I think profoundly reflects the creators and the race and the gender and the educational level of the creators of that algorithm, and not the way particularly maybe women or some people of color speak to each other. And so I think we need to drill down not only in kind of data use, but how the architecture of the very platforms is created and what kind of inherent, some of the work we do at CDT is what is the inherent or implicit bias of the architecture and how can we dispel that power asymmetry. So
are you promoting algorithmic transparency or algorithmic accountability?
So algorithmic transparency. Has anyone ever read an algorithm? Do you know how many ones and zeros? Like, 47 lines of code. I have no interest. I am not an engineer. I am,
But what about accountability?
But transparency in the value structure, in how it is created and what is promoted. So not the actual lines of code, but knowing that the Facebook newsfeed algorithm promotes this kind of information versus that, or what goes into it, or even better, being able to change it and modify it for your own usage. So these are all great solutions, and we have yet to see them fully implemented, but absolutely transparency and accountability is step one. It's not enough, but it is essential.
How about up here?
Hi, I'm Melissa. I'm from Texas, Fort Worth, Texas. And my question is about more on the digital front. I'm an old millennial, not quite 35. I don't have cable. I don't watch cable news. I consume 90% NPR. Huge fan. Both mostly on the radio, but also via Facebook, which is pretty much my primary use for Facebook at this point, is just to follow news organizations. So my question, and we also read The Atlantic, and that's the only magazine we get in my house. So this is very fitting for me. And when we do have to watch cable news, we watch CNN, which only happens maybe 3 times a year. We have the app. So that said, I want to paint that picture because I feel like my question for you is the comment section. Why are legitimate news organizations like NPR posting legitimate news articles and then allowing the horrific fodder that is occurring in the comment section, total fake news? Well, for me, because a lot of my friends look at me as an arbiter of news because I'm passionate about this and I'm passionate about journalism, so they follow me in order to see what I'm sharing. And unfortunately, when I share those articles, I'm also sharing those comments, which I think is a really poor source of news. And if you get down that deep dive, you can learn a lot of things that aren't true and aren't relevant. So I'd love to know what the purpose is and if y'all are doing research on that. Thanks.
At least at theatlantic.com and npr.org, if you read the stories, you will not find a comment section underneath them. So comments. Yes, on Facebook, however, one of the realities of our universe at the moment is, and I think this is one that's important for us to not just be dismissive of but responsive to as journalists, that our stories will be widely discussed in platforms that we do and don't have a degree of control over. So we may have eliminated comments on our websites, for example, but there are comments in a vast variety of different outlets. Facebook is one of them, but there is a number of others. And I think there's both a danger in those comments they inflect the stories deeply for the people that read them. And I also think that there's a danger for us in being completely dismissive of them. I think that they can sometimes offer some lessons for us as journalists.
Okay, well, we've come to the end of our 90 minutes, and we've seen the press introspective. We've seen we know that the platforms are working towards trying to address at least some of these questions. But in the end, I think it's going to take each of us to become stronger citizens, to become engaged, to renew our role in our democracies. So thank you for coming. Thanks for the panel, and see you around.